Good afternoon. I was telling Matt earlier at lunch that I think this is compared to the data that was presented this morning, I think I just need one slide that just says duh, because most of what I'm going to talk about are just the considerations that we as election administrators have to consider in doing election audits. Most of this is pretty basic, and a lot of it was covered in the previous presentation. I'll just try to go through it quickly and focus on those things that maybe would be less intuitive and might not readily come to mind in looking at audits. So I think the key issue with post-election audits with regard to resources is that there are so many variables that affect the number of people, the amount of time, and the amount of money that it takes to do this. And a lot of that is dependent on your jurisdiction, your voting system. There's just a lot of variables that fall under that. With regard to people, how many people are needed, that's going to depend. Bob did a great job of discussing in the California model that you really don't know that until you've done your random sample, so you have to sort of do a projection based on past experience. It's going to be proportional to the scope of your audit. In our case, we have the 1%, so at least we have a defined scope, although that now is going to be subject to an escalation clause, which is going to be a new variable that we have to key into on that. It's also important to recognize with regard to, if you've not done audits before, post-election audits, that the amount of time you have to conduct those audits and the space available to do them are considerations too, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Who to recruit is linked to your time constraints. There are variable models. I've seen some smaller jurisdictions that just use staff. If you're a county that elections falls under the jurisdiction of an official that does performs multiple county functions, that's where you reach down and you use some of your recorder staff or those types of things. That's a model I've seen. I've seen a model where poll workers are used. This is an issue that was addressed in the recent California clarifications with regard to making sure that the same poll worker that worked out a precinct is not on the audit board for that same precinct. Another just little variable that you have to think about. Actually, when I was in the state of Washington, we would actually go to the political parties and ask them to designate, if it's a 3-member board, we would ask each of the major parties to fill one of those seats, and then we would fill a third one through a recruitment done through the county. Also, use of temporary services, or in large jurisdictions like LA, we have an ongoing registry where people can apply to be on the registry to work in audit activity or any number of canvassing activities. There's a number of roles and responsibilities with regard to people. It's not simply the people sitting there on the county boards. Obviously, they're critical. You need to have tally coordinators, people who are taking that data, collecting it, and putting it into some form so that you're able to compare it to the electronic data and determine if there is a discrepancy or a need to send it out to an additional board for account. Security is an issue, especially as we move more towards audits that are based on close outcomes. Security becomes a huge issue. That was a big issue in 2004 in the recount and the gubernatorial race in the state of Washington. I need supervisors, trainers, media relations, and observer relations. I think that's another thing that if you haven't done it before that's easy to overlook, that you need people who are available to explain the process to the media and who are available to answer questions from the observers so that your observers are not, so they're getting the information they need, but they're not interacting with the people who are actually counting the ballots so they can actually complete the audit. With regard to time, it's important to define the scope of the audit. Much of the discussion earlier today about audits versus recounts and the definition of the audit, I think, is a critical component. There's a lot of talk this morning about the different sampling methods. Advanced preparation is critical and needs to be considered. When you talk about doing an audit within the canvassing period, it's not simply that you come in the morning after the election and you're ready to go with the audit. There's a number of steps in preparation that need to be considered. Depending on how your election system is configured, you have to incorporate ballot sorting and preparation. You need to consider what the work schedules are going to be. I strongly encourage that you have formal training for staff as well as the observers so everybody knows what's actually happening. There's public notice requirements. Facilities is a huge issue. It takes a lot of space to conduct these audits, especially in a way that's transparent that allows for observers to actually see what's going on. In our case, we have our own building, but we literally use every available square footage in that building to conduct the 1%, currently existing 1% that we're currently under. Need to look at room layout again to be sure there's space for observers and that type of thing. There was discussion earlier today about pre-certification versus post-certification audits. I was really glad to hear that discussion. I think that's something that there probably need for further discussion on as we move forward. That ties into the escalation provisions. If you see the provisions that were discussed, that Secretary Bowen just issued, California now, in addition to the 1%, is going to be looking at an escalation process based on the margin of victory. And there are a number of considerations with time with regard to that in terms of which results you use to determine whether or not you've met that threshold for escalation or not. And litigation, I think, is another thing to look at in terms of time, and a lot of this goes back to your advanced preparation, but as you move into those auditing processes that are dependent on the margin of victory, you can expect in emotional and hotly contested races that there can be litigation. Again, in the Washington gubernatorial recount, I mean, it was not unusual simply to be in court the next day simply based on the number of square feet that you allowed people to be away from the tables of the recount, and that stops the process while you're waiting for a judge to make a decision. Money, personnel costs, you're subject to labor agreements, that's a variable in terms of what you pay folks. Facilities I talked about before, supplies, security can be extremely expensive, litigation can be extremely expensive. So again, the more that you can prepare in advance for those things, the better off you're going to be. Some of the advanced considerations, I think it's important to have clear objectives so that people know what the purpose of the audit is. Again, there was a lot of discussion this morning about what the purpose of the audit is, and you want to have that defined up front. Otherwise, people start defining that for you while you're in the process of conducting the audit. Having observer guidelines, good documentation, voter intent definition is a huge issue. Understanding what are your regulations with regard to voter intent, and that keys into the public and the observers understanding, is it a discrepancy if a vote changes in an audit based on voter intent? And that's going to differ based on your regulatory environment. Skip this because I know you want to look at numbers. I've just real quickly done a chart of the 3 largest counties in the state of California with some variable data in Los Angeles County in the November 2006 general election. This gives you some data. We have 3.9 million registered voters. In our 1%, we counted over 25,000 ballots, representing 88 precincts and 52 contests. Once you add in the additional contests to make sure that you touched every contest, it was actually 1.7% of the total. I'm out of time. I'm just going to flip this so you can see it ranges. Ours was 207,000. That's dollars before we added absentees, which we referenced in Bob's presentation. San Diego County, a few other variables, and this will be available on the website. Orange County. These are 1% audits. I wanted to show the difference of a recount. In King County, Washington, looking at the 2004 gubernatorial recount, this was a full recount of one contest of 90,000 ballots. Took in excess of 16 days, running double shifts, over 400 people total, and cost statewide $1.4 million in King County. Easily $1 million of that was in King County. So that gives you a little idea of the variables, and I can answer questions.